I'd always believed I'd witnessed everything the cosmos could throw at me, but the moment we crossed into the graveyard of stars, it hit me how naive that confidence had been. Sector Omega Nihil didn't greet us with the predictable void the manuals insisted on, but with a silence so heavy it felt like it squeezed the air out of your lungs. Through the viewport, the dead stars looked less like celestial corpses and more like cranky elders forced awake too early. Our massive vessel, Eternity, drifted through the skeletal remains of long-dead systems, and I could feel a faint trembling under my skin, as though the ship itself shared my unease. It was then the thought struck me. We weren't welcome here. The darkness seemed to observe us with the same disapproval reserved for uninvited guests, and I sensed with a sickening clarity that we weren't explorers at all, just intruders trespassing where humanity was never meant to wander. When Commander Astrid Black informed us that our mission was to locate the Reaper machine technology and destroy it, I wondered what kind of person could deliver such a statement without a flicker of emotion. She stood before the crew as rigid as one of Eternity's support beams, speaking as if she were assigning routine maintenance rather than confronting the end of entire star systems. Listening to her, I realized most of the crew had no real grasp of the nightmare we'd stepped into. For them, it was another operation, another chance to climb the ranks or earn some reward. For me, it was a twisting weight of fear in my stomach. It felt like the graveyard itself reacted to her announcement with a silent, mocking grin, as though it knew we were already too late, that stars weren't dying at random, but by design. And down my spine crept that familiar, icy warning that something terrible was on its way. As Eternity pushed deeper into the sector, I stood at the observation deck searching for even a fragment of familiar space. Instead, all that met my eyes were scorched frameworks of systems that once glittered on our charts like scattered jewels. Now they were only dim echoes of some ancient disaster too enormous to fully imagine. For a brief moment I caught myself thinking we should have turned back long before we arrived, because no discovery was worth wandering through the ruins of galaxies. But the ship kept advancing with unwavering purpose, and I knew my doubts meant nothing. We were cogs in the vast machine of the Empire, and that machine had no patience for uncertainty. All I could do was hold the railing tightly and fight the nausea caused by the overwhelming sense that something far older and far more powerful than our orders was pulling us forward. What unsettled me most, though, was something stranger, the sensation that I had been through all of this before. Not visually, but emotionally, as though fragments of memories that weren't mine were slipping through the cracks of my mind. I felt echoes of long-lost stars, distant impressions, and faint, cold tingling along the inside of my skull, like invisible fingers tracing patterns. I blamed the stress, the oppressive presence of dead systems, or maybe just my own nerves, but deep down I felt certain that Omega Nihil wasn't simply dark. It was anticipating us. It felt as if the void had known we were coming long before we crossed its threshold, and had been paying attention to every move we made. And when we passed the invisible boundary of the graveyard of stars, the realization hit me. Something out there wasn't just watching. It was greeting us, judging us, and quietly recording our presence among all the others who had wandered into a place no one should ever enter. I remember the moment we came close enough to the dead system to distinguish the outlines of what had once been planets. They didn't turn, didn't glow, didn't show a hint of motion. They simply hung there in the dark, like the shattered teeth of some fallen colossus. I stared at them on the main display, trying to understand how ancient and powerful the force must have been to reduce a star to cold, lifeless debris. A technician stood beside me, and he later admitted he felt a sudden tightening in his temples, as though something were pressing outward from inside his skull. Back then, I didn't link it to the environment around us, but the sensation that space itself was observing our presence kept growing stronger. It felt as if every scrap of rock, every dark surface, was silently measuring us, deciding how long we'd survive in this motionless parade of stellar corpses. As we moved farther into the region of ancient wreckage, I began noticing how strained the crew had become. People walked quickly, spoke briefly, and many stayed close to the ship's interior areas, as if putting more bulk between themselves and the hull could shield them from the oppressive weight filling the air. It took time for me to admit I felt the same thing, not pain, but a mental heaviness that settled like a thick cover over every thought. It seemed to echo in time with an unseen pulse, and part of me expected a heartbeat to form. Yet the silence only deepened. Some crew members avoided looking out into space entirely, as if afraid they'd see not themselves in the glass but something older and alien staring back. And the deeper we moved into that dead sector, the more convinced I became that we were disturbing something that would not easily forgive being roused. Soon the engineers began reporting odd sensor readings. They said the instruments picked up faint oscillations, as though the space around us gently quivered, like a gigantic string touched by an unseen hand. I stood in the star gallery trying to sense it, but it remained more of an intuition than a physical sensation. Witnessing the ruins of civilizations beyond anything I could conceive stirred a blend of wonder and dread in me. Twisted spiral formations, remnants of colossal platforms, vast metal rings, older than our recorded history. All of it lay scattered before us, undeniable proof that even the mightiest had fallen to the reapers. Each structure we passed added another weight to the truth pressing on my mind. We were walking through a necropolis left unguarded only because those who built it believed no visitor would ever return. The worst came later, when several crew members confessed they felt as though someone stood behind them, not in the corridors, but inside their minds, a muted awareness they couldn't shake. One technician described it as though the void had singled us out. I tried joking at first to ease the fear, but the darkness outside was already pushing at the edges of my thoughts. As we slipped past another ruined world, I suddenly imagined it reaching toward us with unseen hands, trying to brush against us, taste us, learn what we were. I kept insisting to myself that it was just stress, but the chill inside wouldn't lift. It felt as though this place wasn't merely lifeless. It was observing, not through eyes but through the very shape of the void, as if space itself had decided to see how much of our sanity it could strip away. I will never forget the moment the veil of cosmic dust thinned and something emerged ahead, something so unreal my mind tried to dismiss it as a malfunction. A colossal silhouette, stretching for dozens of kilometers, drifted out of the darkness as though the bones of some ancient titan were being dragged from the void itself. My throat tightened, even though I wasn't trying to speak. Inside that vast shadow, something shifted, faint, barely detectable, like the fading twitch of life lingering in a corpse. When we finally understood that we were looking at a ship, if the term even applied, I felt an unsettling certainty that this wasn't Reaper technology, but a forgotten idol of theirs. Its form was wrong in ways my brain struggled to accept, as if countless designers had shaped it simultaneously, each envisioning their own perfect construct. And despite the absence of power, the thing didn't feel lifeless, only dormant, as though waiting for the right moment to open an eye, or whatever its kind used in place of one. As we closed the distance, details surfaced that made me question the reliability of my senses. The Echo's outer surface wasn't just metal. It moved as though it were breathing. It wasn't the vibration of machinery or hull stress. It was genuine respiration, slow and rhythmic, the kind of motion found in a creature in deep rest. Watching those expansions and contractions, I felt a tingling in my fingers, as though its biological structures were trying to reach me through vacuum and reinforced glass. Parts of its exterior resembled ribs, others intertwined channels that looked like vessels, frozen at the instant of their final pulse. It felt like seeing a city formed by a living organism and a metalworker who had studied life without truly understanding it. That fusion of flesh-like design and mechanical geometry stirred a strange mixture of awe and instinctive fear, drawing my eyes back even when my instincts told me to avert them. The nearer we got, the stronger the impression became that the echo was aware of our presence. No signals, no sensor anomalies, no activity registered, yet a sense of consciousness lingered around it. Standing at the navigation console, I felt my heartbeat quicken, as if part of me were responding to an unheard summons. Officers debated structural integrity, degrees of damage, and potential ingress points, but their voices came through muted, as though the space surrounding the echo swallowed sound and feeling, leaving only stark concentration. I found myself watching the gigantic form like one watches a still predator, perfectly motionless, yet capable of sudden violence. And the longer I observed it, the more convinced I became that this was not merely a vessel but a being that had chosen immobility ages ago, and now waited for someone to come close. What unsettled me most was the absence of fear. Instead, a peculiar calm settled inside me, as if some part of me had always known we would discover the echo, that everything so far had been a path leading directly to this moment. The space around it felt thicker, stretched tight like a membrane on the verge of tearing from our approach. I tried attributing this sensation to fatigue or stress, but it only intensified. It squeezed tighter around my chest when the massive breach in the echo's hull came into view, a wound carved by something unimaginably strong. Within that gash, I saw intertwined structures reminiscent of nerves, and I finally understood. We hadn't found the wreck of a machine, but the body of a being that had endured far too much and retained too little to be considered alive by our standards. And yet it lived, and I sensed that it was already aware of us. When we first stepped through the breach in the echo's hull, the air, if it could even be called that, clung to my skin, leaving cold, sticky traces on the exposed areas of my suit. The corridor ahead didn't feel constructed by hands or machines. The walls seemed to inhale and exhale slowly, each pulse lingering as though the ship were drawing in the memory of our presence. I tried to maintain professional composure, but our footsteps echoed in a strange way, not repeating our sound, but twisting it, adding something living and unnerving to every step. The floor beneath us shifted slightly, as if it were a network of muscle fibers ready to contract at any moment. And with every meter, it became clear. We weren't just walking through a vessel. We were moving through a body that had once lived and might now be stirring because of our intrusion. Gravity began to fluctuate after the first 20 meters. At first, it was a light churn in the stomach, like an elevator moving a few extra floors. Soon, our steps felt as though we were sinking, even though the floor remained firm. I watched the shoulder indicators jump as gravity readings spiked, as if an unseen hand were adjusting space itself. In one corridor, the scout's flashlight bent slightly, as though the beam were passing through invisible ripples. It felt as though the corridor itself was choosing how to allow us forward. Nausea came quickly, and each breath felt unnaturally deep, as if something were drawing me into the ship's biomechanical maw. At times, the wall on the left quivered, and I struggled not to think about what might be there, where only empty hull should exist. I found myself staring straight ahead to avoid the pulsing surfaces at my sides, because my eyes began to play tricks. Occasionally, faint sparks seemed to ripple along the walls, like nerve signals in a colossal organism. The scouts moved silently, but the tension was shared. Even the sound of our breathing seemed amplified, as if the ship were memorizing its rhythm and testing it within itself. I concentrated on footing and balance in the fluctuating gravity, but the awareness that something living lay beneath us never faded. At times, the walls no longer seemed like structures. They appeared as living flanks, capable of contracting in response to our movement. And I realized I wouldn't have been surprised if the floor suddenly surged in waves, attempting to push us off our path. The most unnerving moment came when Astrid, walking ahead, suddenly paused and tilted her head slightly, as if hearing something only she could perceive. From her stance, I understood she felt it too, only stronger. Watching her was like seeing someone recognize they were being observed from the dark. She later said it felt like a gaze, but not from outside, from within the ship itself, as though the entire space had fixed its attention on us. I began to feel the same. Each step echoed inside a foreign awareness, trying to understand who we were and why we had come. The air, or whatever filled it, grew thick and heavy, like the calm before a storm, and I felt the echo draw in a deep breath, preparing to decide what to do with us. In that moment I realized we weren't explorers here. We were uninvited guests, yet the ship had been waiting for us. When we entered the chamber later called the Soul Vault, I initially assumed it was just another strange room within Echo, where the walls seemed almost alive. But when the light from our flashlights caught on countless crystalline formations, I realized my mistake. The space wasn't merely illuminated. It pulsed with the presence of something vast and immaterial. The crystals rose like frozen trees, faint lights shimmering faintly within them. As I stepped closer, I sensed a cold, gentle pressure in my mind, as if something were examining it at a profound level. It felt like someone leafing carefully through memories that weren't theirs, touching them without causing harm. Slowly I understood that these lights weren't energy sources or machinery, but fragments of consciousness preserved within the crystalline lattice. The deeper we moved, the more the silence thickened, carrying a sense of breathing and faint, flickering whispers. It felt as though the space around me was filled with countless foreign lives, each reaching thin threads toward my mind, attempting to communicate something urgent. A mix of fear and awe swept over me. It seemed as if I were standing among endless histories predating humanity. At times I thought I glimpsed shapes of lost cities, vanished civilizations, and flashes of stellar wars that would never appear in our records. I couldn't be sure if it was vision or imagination, but the sensation of these alien memories was so vivid that it felt like living an entire age in a single moment. And the longer I stared into the glowing matrices, the stronger the sense grew that this place wasn't a museum or storage vault, but a single, colossal consciousness expanding over centuries. Astrid halted among the crystals, and her expression shifted, calm, almost as if she had discerned the hidden pattern connecting everything around us. She later described sensing not only the flow of alien memories but their underlying structure, ordered, almost mathematical. The crystals weren't mere archives in the conventional sense, but something resembling a self-aware library where each consciousness contributed to a collective intelligence. She realized Echo hadn't been constructed as a weapon, but as a repository, the final memory of extinct civilizations, gathered by the Reaper machines for reasons beyond our understanding. The scope was both terrifying and astonishing. Millions of lives, their bodies long vanished, their worlds turned to dust, yet preserved here, inside this biomechanical giant hovering between life and death. The most extraordinary part was how Echo seemed aware of us. The crystals brightened, as though recognizing something in our presence that had never entered before. I felt a faint pressure in my mind, not threatening, but insistent, as if urging me to perceive something crucial. With my eyes closed, I sensed, standing on the edge of a vast ocean of consciousness, reaching toward my own. It was as if we were witnessing not a relic, but a living entity composed of millions of voices, each trying to speak. At that moment I realized the most unsettling truth might not be that the Reapers destroyed civilizations, but that they had preserved every one of them. It was as though they were compiling a complete catalog of a dead universe, awaiting someone like us to arrive and understand the immense silence that had settled over the graveyard of stars. I remember the moment it all started, even though I tried to convince myself at the time that it was nothing more than exhaustion after a sleepless day. A strange, muted quiet settled over the eternity, as if the ship itself were straining to hear what was unfolding inside its corridors. The first signs didn't appear as fear or chaos, but as a soft, intrusive presence in the mind that none of us were prepared for. Crew members began reporting faint voices, whispers that couldn't be made out, yet refused to be ignored. I first heard them during my shift, a distant echo, like someone standing behind a thin barrier, waiting for me to listen. I blamed fatigue, or the lingering effects of the echo, but the sensation only deepened, becoming a subtle vibration in my skull. And the harder I tried to dismiss it, the more I felt something rummaging through my thoughts, turning them like pages in a worn book. Engineer Kyle was the first to shatter our illusion of control and force us to admit that something far beyond our understanding was happening. He had always been calm and reliable, yet that day he suddenly began speaking in a language none of us recognized. It wasn't gibberish or confusion. The speech was coherent, steady, as though he were explaining something or recalling it. His voice carried the weight of distant ages, and I saw his fingers tremble as if he sensed the words weren't his own. Later he told us he hadn't understood a single thing he said, and that it felt as though something inside him had borrowed his voice to deliver a message. That was when I realized the contamination wasn't a passive effect from being near the echo. It was active, reshaping us, turning our minds into distorted reflections of someone else's memories. And the more we tried to make sense of it, the clearer it became that something aboard the ship was awakening through us. Next was Leah, our navigator, and her experience confirmed our worst fears. She had always been precise, almost obsessive with her calculations, but one day I found her at the navigation table with an expression that made my blood turn cold. She was drawing maps, but not of any space we knew. They were elaborate patterns resembling webs of galaxies that matched no imperial or historical chart. When I asked what she was doing, she calmly said she was remembering, but not her memories. She claimed those star systems had vanished millions of years ago, and she knew this as surely as she knew her own name. Her hands were shaking, and her eyes looked distant, focused on a place no human had ever seen. In that moment I understood that the echo's remembrance wasn't merely brushing against us. It was trying to replace us, using our minds as vessels for something that had refused to disappear. But the worst came later, when we realized none of us could trust our own thoughts anymore. Sleep no longer brought relief. It became an entryway through which foreign histories slipped in, layering themselves over our own memories until we became mixtures of ourselves and remnants of other lives. I found myself recalling experiences I'd never lived and seeing faces of beings I'd never encountered. A quiet chorus grew within me, trying to form words but unable to break through. People moved through the ship with unnatural quiet, as if any loud noise might tear open the fragile barrier between our minds and whatever was seeping in. And as that inner murmuring grew stronger, I understood with painful clarity. The echo wasn't just a vessel. It was a consciousness, vast, ancient, made of countless voices, and now it was trying to remember itself through us. When the tension finally reached its peak, the crew fractured into two opposing factions, bright and fierce, like sparks in a dark room. Some believed the echo was a malevolent force, already seeping into our minds and only waiting for the perfect moment to destroy us from within. Others, drawn by the subtle voices they heard, interpreted its presence as a revelation, a source of knowledge humanity could never access on its own. Arguments flared. Some demanded we leave orbit immediately, while others insisted on delving further into the memory halls, seeking more. Amid this turmoil, Astrid felt the full weight of expectation from both sides pressing down on her, as though she alone could prevent a complete collapse of the crew, even as she doubted whether she still had the clarity to remain impartial. The situation grew even more complex because it was impossible to tell who was truly speaking, the person themselves, or an alien consciousness whispering through them. Kyle, who had recently terrified everyone with his strange, ancient speech, now claimed the echo was trying to guide us away from a catastrophe that had wiped out entire civilizations. Leah, once a model of precise logic, now spoke in almost reverent tones, urging connection with the ship. Those who remained cautious saw all this as a sign of total mental unraveling, yet proving it was futile. Even our own dreams no longer felt solely our own. Every argument carried the weight of an invisible observer judging us, subtly pushing us toward a conclusion we could not yet grasp. As captain, Astrid was supposed to embody steadiness, But she knew the truth. She was affected just as much as the rest. Images of Star Wars she had never experienced surfaced in her mind, shapes of beings long reduced to cosmic dust. At times she found herself responding to the voices, as if conversing not with herself, but with something ancient, vast, and achingly lonely. She feared admitting this, knowing it would undermine her authority. Yet an even deeper fear was that part of her had started seeing the voices not as threats, but as companions. Each direct question from the crew made her pause, wary of answering in a voice that might not entirely be her own. When the conflict reached its height, the ship became a labyrinth of wary glances and unspoken thoughts. Teams no longer trusted one another, sharing information only through Astrid, and even then, with suspicion. It felt as though a single spark could ignite panic or spark outright confrontation. Astrid moved quickly. She created temporary isolated zones to separate the most radical crew members, enforced strict communication protocols, but nothing could fully halt the rising chaos. And the more she struggled to maintain order, the louder she heard the quiet, many-voiced echo inside her, whispering that division was inevitable, that it was necessary, and that each side only perceived part of the truth. The whisper tightened her chest, for she knew she would soon have to choose, and that every option would carry a price. When I first felt that strange pressure building in my temples, I realized that Astrid was hiding something, despite her effort to remain confident and commanding. We all suspected that the echo had infiltrated her mind, but none of us grasped the magnitude of it. Later she admitted that an endless cascade of images had erupted inside her, as if the history of a dead universe had been flipped through in a single heartbeat. I watched her leave the strategic center, gripping the railings as though a storm had suddenly taken hold of her. It felt as though she might either break entirely or ascend to a new level of understanding. Yet, at that moment, no one could predict which path she would take. We could only watch a person defined by duty and discipline confront something far beyond any military protocol. Over time, it became clear that the echo wasn't simply showing her visions of extinct worlds. It compelled her to experience every destruction firsthand, as if she were standing on the surfaces of planets slowly sinking into silence. She told us she could feel not only the fear of those beings, but also their desperate longing to be remembered, reaching across space and time. Watching her became increasingly difficult. She avoided direct light and often held her head as if an invisible storm raged inside her skull. We all understood that the ship was attempting to make her the bridge between itself and us, that she was meant to become the witness it desperately sought. But the deeper she descended into this flood of memory, the more uncertain it became whether she could maintain her own identity. I remember entering the control room once to find her standing perfectly still, as if the world around her had paused. Her expression revealed she was experiencing something impossible to describe. Terror and awe blended with a profound, almost painful understanding. She later explained that in that instant she saw the fall of a civilization that had tried to survive through enormous fortress cities, only to be swallowed by darkness. Every vision carried the same despair, the same silent plea that if no one remembered them, they would vanish completely. I stood beside her, knowing she was drowning in a sea of lives that were not her own, and that we were the price the echo demanded for its knowledge. And although I wanted to support her, it was clear she had almost no choice. When she finally gathered us in the central bay, exhaustion was written across her face in a way that made me fear for her safety for the first time. She said that the echo demanded only one thing, that at least one person become the vessel for this universal memory. Yet between the lines, it was evident that if she agreed, our crew would be irreversibly changed, as 1,000,000 voices would seek new minds to inhabit. And if she refused, the last connection linking countless dead worlds to the living galaxy would be severed. I watched her eyes and saw guilt, fear, and quiet determination all intertwined. She faced a choice that fit neither military doctrine nor moral law. In that moment I understood that whatever she decided, neither she nor any of us would ever be the same. I saw Astrid standing before the control panel, and by the faint tension in her fingers, it was obvious she was close to some breaking point. Whether it was the weight of a decision or sheer despair, I couldn't tell anymore. The air in the bay felt unnaturally heavy, as if packed with the pressure of billions of voices pressing against the walls of the echo, trying to spill into our world. It was only a distortion brought on by our contact with the colossal ship, yet it felt almost real, like their breath hovered around us. I had the sense that if I moved even slightly, I might slip straight into that immense silence. Not emptiness, but a dense ocean of memories from countless lost worlds. And in the middle of that unbearable tension stood Astrid, forced to choose a path that would determine not only her own fate, but the fate of everyone still fighting to hold on to themselves aboard the Eternity. All of us knew that destroying the Echo wasn't just a strategic choice, but the obliteration of the final remnants of civilizations the galaxy would never recall again. Astrid understood this better than any of us. She carried fragments of their sorrow inside her, and I saw that sorrow strain her judgment, pulling her between cold reason and a kind of compassion for beings that had ceased to exist ages ago. But another fear was growing in her as well, the fear of losing us. I sensed that she no longer saw us as subordinates or resources, but as the last anchors connecting her to what was real. With every hour, it became harder to tell which of her thoughts still came from her, and which were shaped by the voices whispering through the echo, and that uncertainty gnawed at all of us as much as it did at her. Yet allowing the echo to complete what it had begun meant accepting that our minds would become vessels for histories not our own. I tried to imagine living with my own memories tangled together with those of entire species that had vanished long before humanity existed, and the thought was terrifying. We could lose our names, our reactions, our habits, our laughter, even our fears, everything that defined us, all so that someone, somewhere, could say we carried the legacies of alien worlds. I watched Astrid trying to keep a pencil steady over the route map, her hand trembling not from fatigue, but from the knowledge that any decision she made would condemn her. Either she would be responsible for erasing the last echoes of the universe's dead, or she would allow her crew to dissolve into a vast, unending choir of foreign memories. When she finally raised her eyes, I realized the choice had already taken shape inside her. What I saw there was a mixture of profound sorrow and a firm resolve that appears only in those willing to face consequences others would flee from. It was as if she had absorbed the silence of countless lost civilizations, and along with it, a burden owed to the living. We stood around her, each of us hiding our fear as best we could, because in that moment she needed our steadiness, even if it was as fragile as everything that keeps a person suspended between what was and what might come. I didn't know which course she would take, but I could see that the decision had already transformed her, and somewhere deep inside I understood that whichever direction she chose, there would be no return for any of us. I watched Astrid lift her hand toward the control panel, and it felt as though the world itself had paused. A strange sensation stirred within me, as if the Eternity recognized that something far greater than war or duty was unfolding. The panel's lights glimmered a soft blue across her face, and for the first time I felt not fear, but a cold awe, as though we were witnessing a ritual forbidden to outsiders. I understood that each passing second of the countdown was a step toward the infinite, that her choice would shape not only our fate, but the preserved memories of millions of beings contained within Echo's crystals. Astrid held her breath, and in her eyes I saw a mix of guilt, exhaustion, and the weight of an extraordinary responsibility, for both the crew and the countless voices now resting on her decision. If she chose to destroy Echo, I realized we would not merely be dismantling a machine, but erasing an entire universe of memories. Yet this act offered a chance for us to survive, to safeguard the remnants of human will and freedom. I saw the ship's walls tremble slightly as if Echo itself sensed its imminent end. Then something remarkable happened. The crystals housing millions of souls glowed softly, sending a gentle farewell to Astrid. She froze, sensing it, and a fleeting smile touched her lips. A moment of understanding that even in destruction, memory could convey meaning, leaving traces that endure. I saw in the crew's eyes a mix of terror and relief, knowing that ending Echo would not plunge us into endless darkness. Had she chosen differently, everything would have been changed. The crew would have become part of Echo's core, each of us dissolving into that vast sea of alien memories. I tried to imagine the experience, being oneself while simultaneously becoming all those lost civilizations, feeling every joy and agony that could no longer be truly ours. In that thought, I felt both awe and dread. We would have become part of something infinite, far beyond individual existence. I would have witnessed the fall of every galaxy, heard the laughter and cries of civilizations long gone, and perhaps allowed the living world to know their stories through us. But the price would have been absolute, the final surrender of human identity. When Astrid pressed the button, a vibration ran through the eternity, as if the ship itself shuddered under the weight of the decision. Light flared around her in a brilliant surge, and for a brief instant we heard a whisper from within, not threatening, not commanding, but quiet, almost thankful. Echo's final message, a reminder that the memory of the universe could endure even through its own destruction. We exhaled together, terrified, yet relieved, understanding that the choice was right. I watched the darkness of the graveyard gradually recede, and the light of surviving minds and hearts return. And then it struck me, sometimes preserving the light requires sacrificing the very notion of immortality, and within that sacrifice lies something sacred, a weight that remains with us forever.